I'm Linda Hirsch. Welcome back to a new season of EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education. After decades of isolation from the U.S., Cuba is once again welcoming Americans to its beaches, restaurants, cultural attractions, and perhaps its schools. This tiny island with its meager economy has an amazing success story. Nearly 100% of its citizens are literate. In 2011, I visited Cuba as part of an educator's tour. Since then, Cuba has become even more accessible. In the summer of 2015, a group of faculty from Hostos Community College visited Cuba. They met with Cuban educators and public health officials to talk about and share practices and challenges. Today, two colleagues on that trip join me for a candid conversation about Cuba today and what these educators learned from each other. My guests today are Professor Elys Vasquez-Iscan of the Education Department at Hostos Community College and Professor Lisa Tappeiner, the librarian in charge of collection development and technology. Welcome to EdCast and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm aware that Cuba has a very high literacy rate that's become very public knowledge, and I know that you went with Hostos faculty this summer on a trip to visit Cuba. Tell us a little bit about that trip, why you went, what was the focus, who went?
Well, the trip was organized by our Center for Teaching and Learning. At the time, it was headed up by Professor Nelson Nunez Rodriguez, who is Cuban. And he put together a faculty development seminar with Lourdes Torres, our grants officer. And they just put out a call for participation for all faculty, adjunct, and full-time. And I think HEOs were also included in the call for participation.
How many people ended up going?
About 16.
And from what aspects, what areas of the college were people from?
We had humanities, we had the business program, education, librarians,
sociology.
Dental hygiene.
Dental hygiene. It was nicely multidisciplinary. We also had our president, the college president went, and we were accompanied by the former director of the Hostos Center for Arts and Culture, Wally Edgecombe, who grew up in Cuba.
Oh, so you had quite a diverse group of people.
Yes.
How long were you there?
We were there for about 20 days.
Yep.
And where did you go?
Well, the trip was mostly centered in Havana. We stayed at the same hotel the whole time and studied at the same center. We'll talk about that later. And then on the weekends, we had free time. So I went, I think it was just overnight to Vinales in western Cuba. Some of us went to day trips to other places, but mostly it was centered in Havana.
You were part of a faculty development seminar, so tell us just as an overview, what were some of the topics that you were examining while you were there?
Well, we looked at issues of remediation in academia. How does Cuba deal with its student population that needs remediation? We also looked at faculty development. What requirements are in place for academics teaching in Cuba? And in contrast, we had a knowledge base of what we required in the U.S. So it was interesting to compare and contrast differences.
Now, tell us a little bit about just some education background in Cuba. Is education required? What are the ages of going to school?
Right, so education is compulsory from the first grade, which is primary school, up until the 9th grade, which is considered secondary. Preschool, anywhere from 6 months to the age of 5 is not compulsory, and neither is it after the 10th grade.
And are there any costs involved in education?
No, it's universal.
No. All the way through college.
All the way through college. We're going to talk a little bit later about college and how it's not available to everybody, but it's free. Okay, so let's talk pedagogy, which we love to do on EdCast, right? What are some of the pedagogical principles that you found undergird education in Cuba and possibly the great success that Cuba has in terms of educating its population?
Well, Cuba prides itself on having education that prepares people not just to work enter the workforce, but also to be better citizens in humanity, to be patriotic, to have values. The educational system instills in them value and the appreciation of labor. And this is seen in their activities on a weekly basis, where students are given 2 hours every week of value education. And they're also required to participate in labor activities, not for profit, but just to instill in them the love of education. So they have gardens that they participate in, and they also repair a lot of the furniture in the schools. They mend a lot of the books, and this keeps defrays the cost of education, but it also teaches them about, as a community, working and the love of work.
That's a very positive thing, actually. In terms of values, I know people are thinking, and I know I was thinking, because this comes up here in the United States also. How do you teach values? I mean, do you just say this is the, I know you're, by actually doing the work, you are teaching a value of doing work, a value of collaboration, a value of not taking things for granted, but in general, how else do you see they are teaching values in a way that we might want to emulate?
One thing that struck me was the sense that democracy was very important, that the student voice, as well as the professor's voice, the teacher's voice, was valued in the classroom. They talked about teaching students how to solve problems together and communicate respectfully with one another. So things that you don't necessarily hear about in terms of what happens in a classroom in the United States is sort of important in how they manage their classrooms, and I think that's the value of communicating, instilling collaboration, a spirit of working together.
I've never heard it put in quite that way, and I'm already thinking to myself, well, democracy, that's a kind of irony in a certain way,
Yes.
because it's certainly not a democratically run country, so that's something we're going to get back to. And I have to say that on my trip to Cuba, I was aware of that as well. There is a lot of attention paid to democracy, and yet we're not, most people would say Cuba is not a democracy. So we're really going to have to talk about, I hope later, about how they kind of reconcile those things in a way that makes sense to the people who are participating. I think it must be difficult. Now, faculty development in terms of education is a big issue in the United States right now. How should teachers be prepared? Our teacher education programs are taking big hits that they're not really preparing teachers adequately and in the right way. What did you notice about teacher preparation in Cuba that you think is worth emulating, or that was just interesting to you?
Well, the one thing is that the status of educators is much higher.
Okay.
They are highly regarded, and they're seen as professional, and they're paid commensurate with other professionals. They have an extensive amount of pre-service training prior to becoming educators, and they have continuous support during their career. They create these communities that are called pedagogical communities for each discipline. So as these communities come together every month, they discuss challenges in their field, and they work together in arriving to solutions in how to better implement the curriculum. Innovation is awarded also, which is very interesting, because you would think that in a repressive society, being an innovator is not really something that is looked upon highly, but they are rewarded for being innovators.
I want to say at the outset that Cuba is an anomaly in many ways. When you visit Cuba, you are really struck by how it's a bundle of contradictions that makes it not seem so repressive when you're there in terms of other repressive countries where you feel it. You really don't feel it that much in Cuba. So it must be because of these different approaches. It's an interesting, that's why people are going to go visit.
One thing that struck me also was that for training teachers who are, say, scientists or who are not educators but are in the disciplines, there are teams of pedagogical specialists and then subject specialists who come together and work together to kind of make a program, a pedagogical program for a specific discipline. I thought that was really interesting.
For all grades?
This is for higher education.
This is for higher ed?
For higher education.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. And well, in secondary and primary and secondary education, what they have is community of educators, and these communities are composed of teachers, depending on the level, and they develop and design any issues that they find in the classrooms.
Do they watch each other teach? Do they visit each other? Do you know?
I don't know if they visit each other, but I'm thinking that because they're so supportive and they provide ongoing support throughout their career, it's not just, we're training you, now you're going to go off, be dispatched into the classroom and you're on your own. It's a continuous process.
Yeah, you do get the sense that they are kind of revisiting their teaching practice as a group.
So in the U.S., we've had this approach currently where we really curtailed the amount of time teachers need to prepare to teach. They could go to a program like Teach for America or the New York City Teaching Fellows and really get into the classroom with minimal preparation. And I know we're rethinking that, but what would be the approach in Cuba to getting a teacher ready to teach?
Well, they have to spend a whole summer of pre-service before entering the classroom. And they do weekly trainings as a community. So every week they come together and they're required. Do they apprentice
like a student teacher, or do they go right into?
Well, they do apprentice as the pre-service. And then during their first year of teaching, they are kind of an auxiliary in the classroom. And then once they have mastered certain aspects, then they're given their own classroom. But even then, because they're part of that teaching community, they go in there and they express their challenges, and it's based on, this community is composed of different levels of educators, so you have the more senior ones providing advice to the more newer ones.
Going back to what Lisa said about higher ed, in the United States, most of our professorial rank teachers don't really get pedagogical development.
Right.
What's important is that you know the content, I guess. So what did you think of that approach?
I definitely got the impression that they are trained as teachers as well as being experts in their subject, and that they're working with people who are pedagogical experts all the time, to refine their teaching, to talk about new methods of teaching, to look at outcomes assessment. We talked a little bit about that. So no, I think they see their role as not just a subject specialist, but also as educators and teachers.
And this is regardless if they're going to become professors. Their rationale is that even if you don't step into the classroom, you're going to be a mentor, you're going to be a supervisor. So you need to mentor the next coming generation, so you need to have those pedagogical skills.
You had the opportunity to meet with many people in Cuba, and one of the educators that you met was Ana Sanchez, and she talks a little bit about the Cuban philosophy behind education, so let's take a look.
Para mí la educación es depositar en todo ser humano toda la obra que le ha antecedido, es ponerlo a la altura de su tiempo. Con esto quiero decir que la educación tiene un carácter histórico concreto, está influenciada por el desarrollo que han alcanzado las fuerzas productivas, que ha alcanzado la ciencia, la técnica. Todo ello repercute en la educación. Pero para mí educar no es solamente transmitir conocimiento, es también transmitir, sentimientos, valores. Y creo que en estos momentos que vivimos de tanta materialidad y que no podemos olvidar que estamos en medio de una crisis sistémica. Y cuando hablo de crisis sistémica, que esa crisis se manifiesta en todas las esferas de la vida social. Estamos siendo testigos de una profunda crisis económica que ha afectado a muchos países de Europa. Los propios Estados Unidos de América también han sido afectados por esa crisis económica, que ha traído como consecuencia también una crisis en el plano político, en el plano ideológico, hay hasta una crisis alimentaria, porque no cabe duda que estamos viviendo momentos bien difíciles de un profundo cambio climático, y si los hombres y las mujeres no cuidamos de la naturaleza, vamos a tener que sufrir mucho, porque realmente estamos dilapidando muchas de las riquezas naturales. Por eso pienso que para mí la educación no solamente es instrucción, es también transmitir sentimientos, valores y sobre todo amor. Creo que estamos viviendo en una época tan rápida, tan dinámica, que a veces se nos olvida hasta a nuestros seres más queridos decirles, o al menos manifestarles lo que significan, cuánto significan para uno, y sobre todo manifestarles nuestro amor. Para mí la educación es también la base de todo desarrollo social, porque en la medida que un pueblo es mejor educado, pues está preparado de una forma más coherente para enfrentar cada reto, para enfrentar los avatares que nos impone la vida. Cuba, no cabe duda que tiene una obra en el plano educacional que mostrar. Una obra que nos ha hecho que, siendo un país de América Latina subdesarrollado, porque siempre tenemos que recordar que Cuba es un país que no tiene grandes recursos naturales y, sin embargo, nuestra mayor riqueza es precisamente el capital humano. Y cuando hablo de capital humano estoy hablando de los profesionales y de los hombres y mujeres que, aun aquellos que no han obtenido una profesión, un título universitario, sí tienen determinados enraizados, no en sí, tienen determinados logros de nuestra educación. Y esa educación es la que ha permitido, a mi modo de ver, que el pueblo cubano haya sido capaz de enfrentar tantos retos en todas las esferas de la vida. Hoy no cabe duda que el Estado cubano está preocupado por el desarrollo de la educación, tanto es así que aproximadamente el 25% del presupuesto anual se le destina a la educación.
What most impressed you about what Ana Sanchez said?
I think what impressed me the most is that she doesn't see education just a transmission of knowledge. She sees it as an opportunity to engage students into becoming better human beings. She believes that values is instilling values in students is an opportunity to create the next generation of professionals that are giving back to society and that are productive, creating a society that's productive and well-rounded.
How did you feel this reconciled with our concepts of education here?
Well, it was interesting. I have a little story about her. We gave a talk, Elys and me and another professor, Sandy Figueroa, about sort of how things run at Hostos. And my section was on educational technology. So I had a slideshow with all the different ways that technology exists in our campus. And the question she asked me was not about using technology, as pedagogical methods, but she said, well, what kind of values are you transmitting through all this technology? And it was
sit up and pay attention.
Well, kind of, right? Or gadgets are fun, or what are the values that we are instilling? We have so many resources. But what are the, what values are going along with those resources? And I think there's some great values.
What was your answer to that?
Well, I was a little tongue-tied. Because, certainly my first thought was more is better, I work in a library where there's a lot of demand for technology and we'd like to have more of it. There's not enough. But also, I think there's also the question of what are we using that technology for? Do we have to keep remembering it's to be educated, at least in our context? And as Elys says, I think sometimes we might lose track of using technology to be better citizens, using technology to be better people. How do we use technology in the service of becoming well-rounded individuals? But it was such a thought-provoking question that she asked.
I get email every day about technology in education, and I'm going to think if I've seen a discussion about how to use technology to become better people. I'm going to go through it all over again.
I cannot
think that I've seen something where that has been, there's so many issues raised about how much and how it relates to actual genuine learning and how students read. Do they read better with technology, without? But I never see, I hate to say never, but I don't recall seeing too much about how to be a better person via technology. That's very interesting. She also says a figure that caught my attention. She said the Cubans spend 25% of their budget on education. That's very high. I thought the figure was somewhat lower. I know they spend more than the U.S. in terms of budget, but can you tell us what you thought of those figures? Were those correct?
Right. So when I further researched the allocation of funding for education, I focused more on the gross domestic product, and I compared it between the U.S. and Cuba. And what it I found is that it's actually, Cuba's is double of the U.S. Cuba's roughly about 12%, whereas the U.S. allocates its gross domestic product to 7% for education. And that's a pretty significant difference. When you look at all other factors, the population, it's an island nation. We are, you know, a much bigger population and country, yet we only allocate 7% of our gross domestic product
now,
to
I
education.
want to go back to something about education itself and pedagogy. She referred to education being more than the transmission of knowledge or the transmission of information. But that very concept of education being the transmission of knowledge is a controversial one here in the United States, or it's certainly one that we talk about, and that is the approach to education being transmission of knowledge or construction of knowledge. In other words, do we want students to receive information, and that would be the lecture format, or do we want them to make meaning for themselves? And so we would call that a constructivist approach versus the transmission model here in the United States. What was your feeling about the pedagogical approaches in Cuba? Is it transmission of information, or is it a more student-centered constructivist approach?
I think that education in Cuba, the way they see it is that education is not just knowledge or information, but it's a celebration of past accomplishments and also a way to prepare students to navigate in society and to address life's challenges in a positive way. When we look at education in the United States, we're looking at when students get a degree, it's so that they can go on and get a job. Now, does that mean that they're going to be able to navigate through hardships and life challenges? It just means that they'll be able to get a job. And once they're unemployed, what happens? How do they handle those hardships? How do they handle navigating through obstacles in life?
Not well.
Not well.
Not that well. So you think they pay more attention to something like that?
Yes.
Lisa?
So we studied at a place called the Center de Estudios Martianos. So it's based on the work and thought of Jose Marti, who's a Cuban philosopher. He was a patriot. He died fighting against the Spanish. And he wrote a lot about education and sort of education in terms of building a nation. I mean, he was fighting for an independent Cuba. And so I think a lot, and this is, Ana Sanchez runs that center, so I think a lot of her philosophy is sort of based on the philosophy of Jose Marti. And so that was definitely what he advocated for, was sort of being educated in order to become a citizen, being educated in order to be in service of the nation. And also he was a poet and he was a literary person, so he believed in, you know, education as building a well-rounded person who had who used their creativity in service of solving problems, who enjoyed the life of the mind.
How important did you think the arts were in terms of education in Cuba?
Very important.
Yes.
And in what way was that manifested?
Well, you see a lot of cultural centers abounding around the different communities that we visited, which I thought was really interesting, because when you think of communism, you think of repression, you don't think of expression, especially artistic expression. When we were there, we had the opportunity to experience the biennial art exhibit. And this is an exhibit that is open to the public. And to me, what floored me was to see that this was an art display for the masses. Now, when you think of
all over
art,
the streets of Cuba.
exactly, it was open. It was indoor,
Havana, yeah.
but it was also out on display in different open street areas. When we think of art and we think of who goes to art exhibits and who goes to museums in the United States, here in New York City,
It's very elite.
it's very elite,
Yes.
and it's very exclusionary.
Now, what was that art like? I know I can hear the thoughts of people watching and saying, well, was it all about propaganda? Because a lot of, you know, when you travel throughout Cuba, it's clear that a lot of the artwork that you see is about Che and about Fidel. And so tell me about the art.
I was surprised. I mean, I was surprised at how political the art was.
It was political.
It was political. I mean, not all of it, but it was very. And there was a lot of reference to U.S.-Cuba relations. I mean, we were there at a time when.
What was that like?
Well, I thought it was pretty sophisticated. You know, it was. You know, American flags and Cuban flags and old newspaper clippings, you know, our history, our long history together, our fraught history. But not just a kind of an embrace of American culture, but also not a complete rejection of American culture. I thought that there was sort of a lot of the art dealt with the Cuban American relationship and our past, and also maybe our future. As
Was the art abstract or I mean, if you
Oh,
don't want to
was
get that
diverse.
technical, but
Yeah, it was very diverse. There were various mediums. You know, I actually was very, I guess I gravitated towards this one photo exhibit that was on the street, and it was a comparison of Havana and Miami. And there were pictures of similar areas in Miami that kind of resemble similar areas in Havana, from the architecture, from just the beachfront. And so it was kind of a way of showing through photograph that there are similarities, even geographically, between Havana and Miami. It's not just that, you know, that's where there's a large Cuban diaspora, but, you know, there is a lot of commonality there. But there was also a lot of abstract art.
now we're running out of time, and I am going to ask you to stay and continue with us for part 2, because we have not even really looked at higher education and public health, and 2 very key things that I do want to talk to you about. So before we go today, could you each just tell me one thing that impressed you the most about what you saw in terms of education in Cuba that you think we can learn from? Lisa, what did you think?
well, to return to the art theme.
Okay.
So there was art everywhere you went in Havana when we were there, and what I loved was you had these little kids going and reading the artist statements that were sort of plastered here and there. So little kids interested in art, interested in kind of understanding.
And they could read.
And one, they could read,
Yeah.
and these were not upper class kids. They were kids who were modestly dressed, you know, with their family out on the Malecon on a Friday night. But they were interested in those ideas, and they looked at the art. And I thought that an education system and a society produced that sort of curiosity and openness to ideas and art. So that struck me.
For me, what I took away as very important is that education is a community responsibility. It's not just falls in the arms of the teachers. The family, the community are all responsible. So it's a communal effort versus an independent venture.
Thank you both so much for joining us. I hope you will come and stay and talk a little bit more for our part 2 of the show about Cuba and education today. Elys Vasquez-Iscan, Lisa Tappeiner, both from Hostos Community College, thanks so much for being here. Don't go away. We'll be right back with our Ed Bites. Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites. The American Academy of Pediatrics will be revising their guidelines regarding children and their exposure to electronic and online media. Currently, they recommend no screen time at all for children under 2 years old and advise parents to model sensible online behaviors. No drastic changes seem likely, but the association will draw on the latest research to enable parents and caregivers to make the best choices regarding children and media. The new guidelines are expected in October 2016. New research indicates that boys are still falling behind girls in academic achievement. They graduate from high school and attend college at lower rates and are more likely to get into trouble. Social scientists now think they have an explanation for this gender gap. Boys seem more sensitive than girls to disadvantage. Negative circumstances such as growing up poor, living in a bad neighborhood, or being fatherless affect them more than girls. Based on these findings, educators and policymakers are looking at ways of devising more positive outcomes for boys. That's it for this edition of EdCast. Till next time, class dismissed.